Hey everyone, welcome to CRT. I'm Bambi Francisco Roizen, and today I have the honor of speaking with Terry Schilling. He's the president of the American Principles Project. Terry, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Oh, I'm very excited to have you because you are on the sort of the leading the charge for bringing family values back to America. So I'm very excited for what you're doing. And thank you for taking the time to speak to us. So let me start with your organization, American Principles Project. It started in 2009, and the mission is to tackle issues critical to protecting human dignity. It was interesting when I was reading that because, you know, we live in a time where I think everything is about protecting human rights, and particularly it's minorities who are looking to protect everything and protect all their rights. And so it was interesting that the APP chose the words human dignity because it almost seemed like, well, in many ways, you are protecting the right to be dignified. And I wasn't sure, was there a reason for the word dignity versus, say, human rights?
Right. Well, no, it was to get back to what the founding fathers wanted for this country, which, I think in my mind, and I'm not an academic, but human dignity implies that these are rights given to us by God that uplift our dignity as human beings, right? So I think that part of the debate today about what's a human right, so many of these human rights actually harm the dignity and the value of the human person or the value of the other people that are getting forgotten about, right? So if you look at some of the arguments right now, one of the fights that we're involved in is age verification online to protect children from adult content. And what will be argued from the left or from those that want to advance the adult entertainment industry is that the rights of consumers are being harmed, that our artistic expression. Well, in our mind, there's children that are being harmed when they get access to this really bad content, obscene content even. And there's also dignity being harmed by the adults that consume it. And you can argue about rights, but those are more empty. What human dignity is about true human flourishing. If you are true human rights that are rights given to us by God, they aren't going to harm humanity. And so it's more about human dignity would be more about the right to do good and not so much the right to do bad. And there are so many things right now in our government and in our law that are rights that are being enshrined that are actually causing harm to humanity and damage to others. And real rights that are given to us by God, true human dignity, doesn't cause any harm to anyone else or even ourselves. And so I think there's a distinction there that's very important.
Well, I think the distinction is God and our definition of, or his definition of what he designed man to be and what dignifies man. I think there are a lot of people who would say, because I argue with many of them, as you probably do too, that what they're trying to do with every type of right they're pursuing is to just be dignified, particularly with the transgender issue. But let's go back to the history of APP again. One of the earlier battles, I guess, you fought, and I don't know if you were there at the time, but it was Common Core. And I do remember this was when I was oblivious to what was happening around us. I thought maybe Common Core is good. Maybe it's not. Now I see everything is, I think a lot of people have woken up to a lot of things being not exactly what they're presented to be. But what is up with Common Core? What was wrong with it?
Well,
what was it?
The main problem with Common Core was that it was not about uplifting the dignity of children or increasing education levels. What Common Core was an education curriculum, if you can call it that, from corporate America. They didn't want education to be about the true fulfillment and development of the human person, to where you're developing people that can think critically and be the people that God designed them to be. It was more about jobs and getting people to be able to do the bare minimum required to meet the demands of industry. And it was essentially, we wrote a report on it, and I thought the title of the report, I think this was in 2011 or 2012, but it was called Cogs in the Machine, right? And that was exactly how the architects of Common Core thought of our children and the future of America. Was these were not human beings. These were individuals that needed to fill different roles within our industries and to meet the demands of industry. Human beings are above the demands of industry. In fact, I would argue, and I think most normal people and sane people would argue, that the point of industry is to serve man. It's not, we obviously have to play our part to build these companies and build these industries, but industry is there to make our lives better, and it's to uplift our human dignity. But the Common Core was terrible standards. They were lower than what most states had at the time, and they didn't actually increase educational progress for our children, but it was being pushed on us by corporate America, the National Governors Association, and government. And it was interesting because the federal government was heavily involved in advancing the Common Core through the Race to the Top program. I've been working in politics now for at least 20 years. And in 2013, when I started working at APP, the fight against Common Core was really starting to take off. And what we learned was, in my fights at the state level, it's kind of tough to get legislation passed at the state level. And what was egregious about the Common Core was that the federal government, through the Race to the Top program, created all of these incentives to trick the states into adopting standards that were actually lower than what they had on the books already. And through the Race to the Top program, it was a competitive grant that the federal government was offering, and the state school boards and the states had to fill out these applications to get funding. And in that, they had to agree to adopt career and college readiness standards. Well, there was never ever such a thing as career and college readiness standards. The only thing that met that definition was the Common Core. They rigged the game, and they did it to try and get all 50 states to go along with the Common Core. It was deceitful, it was nefarious, and it was a terrible curriculum, again, if you can even call it that. But I think a lot of states are actually still on the Common Core or similar type of curriculum.
I was going to ask you about that. Are we done with it, or we're still, some states still have that implemented?
Many states still have that implemented. In fact, one of the tricky things was when we started to actually get states to repeal the Common Core, they would either repeal a very small portion of it or just rename it, right? And what made that fight in opposing the Common Core exceptionally difficult was that there were a lot of Republicans on board. And that was because of the aim to make our students career and college ready. But they tricked a lot of people, and unfortunately it is still in a lot of states. It's been a while, to be honest, since I've been involved in that fight, but it is something that we do feel strongly in opposition to still.
Right. We see the fight seems to have moved on to something even a little bit more like horrific when we think about the whole gender ideology stuff, which we'll talk about. So in 2016, I think the APP, you were already there because you got there in 2013, you focused more on pro-family issues. So, that's in your literature. So you really made a concerted effort to say, okay, we're now pro-family. What was behind that sort of more deliberate and public statement?
What we saw as a major threat to not just families in America, but to America itself, is the political arena for the American family, specifically elections, where candidates have to make a case for policies that they're supporting directly to voters, but also in legislation that was left completely empty almost. There was no one, for example, running campaign ads for or against candidates on cultural issues like the sexualization of our children, or campaign ads against the whole transgender fight, where they were putting men into women's private spaces. And in 2016, it was the first foray into an election for us on the transgender issue. In North Carolina, the LGBT movement had made great advances, and they had. I'm sorry. Could I? Sorry. It's been a slightly long day.
Yeah.
But basically, the governor at the time was a guy named Pat McCrory, and he was a business guy. He was not a culture warrior, but he had signed a law he signed a bill into law that would basically say that local cities could not allow for men to enter women's private spaces. That had to be a state decision, and the state of North Carolina said that men use the men's room and women use the women's room. There is no such thing as transgender women or whatever when it comes to private spaces. Well, the LGBT movement, led by Human Rights Campaign, they met with Pat McCrory. We went down and met with him after the election, and they told him, essentially, we're going to spend $50 million against you, and we're going to unelect you. We're going to collect a scalp here so that no one ever again passes any one of these bathroom bills. And it all came true. Pat McCrory, the incumbent governor of North Carolina, spent, I think, around $21 million to get reelected. He lost by 10,000 votes, but his opponent raised almost $50 million, and the race was decided. And on top of that, the Human Rights Campaign, which is the largest LGBT group in the country, also was very successful in getting corporate America to boycott North Carolina to add to a PR effort around this. This is what the pro-trans rights groups were doing to families, to children, to Republican elected officials if they oppose them. And there was nothing of the equivalent on the other side to push back. And when we met with Governor Pat McCrory about this entire scenario, we wanted to actually find out why he lost, because we had spent around, I think it was around $300,000. There wasn't a lot of demand at the time to oppose anything with the LGBT movement, because we had just had Obergefell, and you had states repealing Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, like Mike Pence did in Indiana. And when we met with him, he told us this story, and he said, I wasn't mad at the president of Human Rights Campaign for telling me that. I was actually more mad at our side, because we didn't have a guy like that to go in there and punish our political opponents. He said, I want that guy on our side. And so we did, it was myself, Frank Cannon, our founding president, and Jeff Bell, who at the time was our late policy director. We spent the whole 7-hour ride back from Charlotte to Washington, D.C., plotting and planning about how we could fill that political gap to oppose these really egregious laws. For example, the goal of Human Rights Campaign is to put sexual orientation and gender identity into civil rights law, right? And if most people don't really understand civil rights law, it's meant to completely eradicate America of racial bigotry, or at least institutionalize racial bigotry. And so when you want to put gender identity into civil rights law, what you're going to do is you're going to make laws that protect children even from these types of gender procedures or hormone treatments. Those laws would be invalidated by civil rights law. It would crush them. And so it was a very, very bad thing, and we wanted to stop it. And that's when we decided to get into the political arena for the American family, to at least stand up to the bullies that were trying to punish governors for having the audacity, I use that word lightly, or obviously tongue in cheek, to protect girls in their most vulnerable spaces, to protect girls' sports. We wanted to change that, and I think we've been pretty successful at that.
Yeah, I remember it was 2014 or 2015. I made a big stink about women's rights, and at the same time, people taking away my bathrooms. And they didn't understand. I was like, well, I don't know. You guys keep complaining, because I hosted a lot of events, and I didn't host enough women to elevate women. So I just made a joke about, if we're elevating women, why are they taking away our bathrooms? And nobody got it. And I, quite frankly, I didn't understand what was going on, the big picture, this big movement, insidious movement that was happening all around us. I didn't make the connection yet, but the bathroom bills fights were a lot bigger, and people should have taken notice, and they did, like your organization. Now, you talked about God quite a bit, and so which makes a lot of sense if you're pro-family, and being having a family foundation is a core principle of the Bible and Christianity. Are you a Christian organization, or is just everybody Christian there? Or with the
no, we're a secular organization, actually, but that doesn't mean that we can't acknowledge properly that our rights come from God. So we don't, when we're running our campaign ads, we're never going to cite the Bible or quote a scripture, but we're going to make the same case for truth about humanity. We do believe that our rights come from God. We know that the Bible is true, but we're trying to appeal to common sense, right? It's common sense that there are certain things you can't change, that there is a natural order, there is a natural law. And when you go away from the natural order or the natural law, you have problems, right? There is a natural morality, and that was not made up by me. I'm just acknowledging it. It was made by God. But men are men, women are women. There are a lot of things you just can't change. And if you try to change the things that are unchangeable, you're not going to have a good time. There's going to be serious problems that are caused by that. And so if I were to summarize what American Principles is all about, it's about the American family, but it's also about opposing all of this crazy sexual stuff that's being pushed on our kids. And the thing that bothers me the most is you have, I would say, left-wing sexual activists that it's part of a sexual liberation movement that not only wants to liberate our children sexually, they want to liberate them from their gender, right? They from my understanding of progressives, they believe that if you are married and have children and identify as your gender, like your sex, you're being oppressed, actually. You're not truly free unless you can break away from all of that and do whatever you want. And there's real attacks on our children to change what they view the purpose of sexual relations is, right? They want to change how we perceive sex and gender and how we interact with each other in society. And I'm not one for rigid gender norms, but I think that men are men and women are women, and that when men try to become women or women try to become men, it makes for a really bad situation, mostly for the individuals that are doing these alterations to their bodies. So we want to protect kids from all these threats. Adults are, obviously free to do what they want, but we got to at least leave the children alone. I think we're just really about common sense in the American family.
So tell me about it sounds like this is like really a core principle, sort of ethos that you have that is not just conservative. There's a lot of conservatives who are fiscally conservative. There's a lot of conservatives who have now maybe shifted right a little bit, but not on the social issues. It sounds very foundational to you. Give me a little bit of your background in terms of what got you to be, so simple-minded, if you want to call it that, to be that man is a man and a woman is a woman and family is a good thing, and the nuclear family. And then what was that journey that led you to the American Principles Project?
Oh, that's very interesting. So I'm the eldest of 10 kids. I was born and raised Catholic, and I wasn't always a good Catholic. I still struggle with my Catholic faith sometimes. I do go to confession frequently. But I think there were several things that drove me to turn APP into the organization it is today. One, I have sisters. I have 4 sisters. I have a mother that I love dearly. I have a wife. I have 3 daughters. And I saw these situations where young girls and women were being assaulted in their private spaces, and even the cases where they weren't being assaulted, they were complaining about having to deal with men in their showers in high schools and in public locker rooms that are reserved for women. And so that really bothered me. I didn't want my wife or my daughters or my sisters to have to deal with that. But then there was something much more nefarious that was starting to happen, which is parents were starting to lose custody over their children for refusing to affirm their child's gender identity. This concept of gender identity is so novel. It's so odd. Most Americans, when they hear gender identity, they don't distinguish it from your biological sex, right? And even saying biological sex is kind of redundant. You just have a sex. You have chromosomes. But I was very, very concerned about the threats to the American family posed by these efforts to enshrine gender identity into civil rights law. I love my children very much. I have 7 children total. You can tell I love kids. They really are. I do think that children make the world a better place.
Doing
They're
your
so
part.
innocent.
Thank you.
I took President. I jokingly tell people that when President Trump said he wanted our elections to be too big to rig, we might have taken him a little bit too seriously. But I just view all these threats. We have so many young people who are refusing to even get married now. They're refusing to have children of their own, and I don't think that these threats to us do anything to help that, right? Especially if you're a good Christian, you're going to be afraid to marry someone in case they're a progressive that ends up trying to trans your kid, and then you get a divorce, and then you lose custody, and you never see your son again. And by the way, they've been sterilized and had their bodies all with the help of your government that you pay taxes to, right? It's a literal nightmare. And so that was my real motivation to stick with fighting the transgender industry. And I call it an industry because it's not really a civil rights movement. That's not why it's exploded. That's not why you hear about it or read about it so much. That's not why legislators have spent the last decade passing laws to make it illegal for psychologists and psychiatrists and therapists to help children feel comfortable in their own bodies, right? This is an industry. We did a report, I think 2 years ago, called the Transgender Industry. And we found that there was over $4.4 billion annually in revenue being raised from these transgender surgeries, from the hormone treatments and the puberty blockers. There's even more money being made by this transgender industry because we didn't account for all of the literature and all of the PR efforts and everything else that they push. That makeup companies now are pushing the whole gender identity issue because they want to be able to expand their customer base to males who identify as women. But there are all of these very problematic things happening, and there's a real industry that's fueling this movement. So it's not a civil rights movement. There's way too few of them. It's growing, by the way, because of what's happened in our schools. But it's not a civil rights movement. It's an absolute industry. And they're taking that $4.5 billion that they make, and they're reinvesting a lot of that into public relations campaigns and into government lobbying to where they can enshrine their profits into law and make it much more difficult to repeal. So the opposing the transgender industry was very important to me, primarily because of the threat that it is to families themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just yes, it's the pharmaceutical companies, it's the medical device companies, it's the hospitals, right? They're all involved in either the drugs or the surgeries, but it's the underlying science, it's the underlying research out there that people are looking at that says that I'm building a business on top of credible science, which is a problem. For instance, I'm in Silicon Valley, and so what I've been doing for most of my entire profession is working with venture capitalists and startups. And I can't tell you how many startups are building technology on this faulty medical, what do you call them? Principles, policies. I mean, they literally are following the DSM-5, which you probably are familiar with, which basically doesn't even diagnose a person who has gender dysphoria. They don't diagnose the gender identity. The diagnostics is around the stress and the depression. And you're supposed to affirm someone affirm their gender identity so their confusion can be gone, but oh, they're going to have lasting stress. Oh, that's what you need to treat them. Need to treat them. And I've had startup CEOs tell me, and this is going to be really sad for you to hear, somebody who has many children. This one CEO said, one of my kids is trans because out of 4. So she's like 25%, right? She's like, that's probably what it is in the population. I mean, that's the market they're going after. They need to see something growing, right? So these are people, and I can't tell if it's, I think some of them are well-intentioned, but it's, yes, I agree with you. It is a big market. And so one of the things I'm curious about is, what about the medical institutions? Why are we giving credence to the American Psychiatric Association, the writers and the authors of the DSM-5 that says this is what gender dysphoria is, and everybody is listening to them?
Well, I think what happened is first of all, these used to be credible institutions, right? They used to be reliable, and it's not just the APA. It's the American Academy of Pediatrics. It's the American Medical Association. The left, and I would say the transgender industry or transgender ideologues, they have taken over and infiltrated these institutions. And so the reason that hospitals and doctors have still been going along with it is because these institutions over the years, they've spent a century almost building up credibility with the expert class that's been paying dues to them and relying on them for a whole host of different issues. And so when they come out with, these are the institutions that are supposed to be reliable, right? It's like, why do voters still trust and listen to the mainstream media after all of the lies that have been exposed? Well, where else are you supposed to go? You're supposed to be able to trust your government, right? You're supposed to be able to trust that when your government comes out and says that 19 was from a bat, you're supposed to be able to trust your government, and they've been lying to us. And so I think that essentially that's all changing. I think that they've ended up hurting their credibility over this issue. And I think that ultimately on the gender identity front, the thing that's going to end up killing the credibility of these organizations and mandating incredible reforms of them is the existence of detransitioners. And it's not just the children who were transitioned at early ages, who went through puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and surgeries, but there's a lot of adults now who are coming out and saying that they regret their gender transitions. There's communities on Reddit, for example, that have over 40,000 subscribers in a detransitioner thread. And it's probably, that was, I think, a couple of years ago that I last saw that number. So it's probably grown then. But the other thing I think that's going to end up hurting these organizations is there's got to be some culpability. There's got to be some liability for their errors in pushing these surgeries and hormone treatments, especially on children, from the liability lawsuits that are coming out. So there's medical malpractice lawsuits that are already underway. There are more that are going to be coming out here in the coming years. But as the more transgender surgeries and hormone treatments that these people do, the more detransitioners we're going to have, because it's all built on lies. And the central lie to this is that men can become women with enough surgeries or enough changes in their hormone levels and vice versa. It's never going to be the case. But I think that there's something even more nefarious that makes this movement incredibly evil, which is to tell children, to tell their parents that unless the parents affirm their child's new gender identity, that the child will commit. When all of the data that we've seen, and there really is very minimum data on this because of how novel it is, that's not true. In fact, the increases after children go through these gender procedures. I was just with Chloe Cole at CPAC, and one thing that she's made very clear in all of her interviews is that when she got her double mastectomy at 15, she was not suicidal before that. She never had any thoughts of suicide. Her thoughts came after the double mastectomy, after the hormone treatments, after the puberty blocking. So we've got to stop this industry. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the medical liability, the liability insurance premiums, those I think are ultimately what's going to do this industry in.
Yeah, I mean, let's hope so, because if you think about what happened with Prozac and antidepressants, and you think about and now I'm starting to say this quite a bit, but so in the 80s, when sort of the Prozac nation became popular, you had all these kids who, it was very popular all of a sudden to call your mental depression a disease. And it was, you had to treat your bipolarism, your manic depression diagnosis, and everybody was mentally disordered, and you had to take Prozac or Zoloft or whatever the SSRI is. And then I don't know if you saw, but around 2013, I guess Eli Lilly isn't making antidepressants anymore. They're not looking for the next antidepressant. But all of a sudden, now you've got this, after 2013, after the DSM-5 was changed to say gender identity disorders, gender dysphoria, you had the market for hormones and surgeries go up. Like, everybody seemed to forget antidepressants and say, hey, look, here's the new market. And all of a sudden your mental disorder was now normal, because now you're normal. So the industry just flipped because they found something else to go chase after. And I hope, and I agree with you, and I think the detransitioners, the rise in those, and the medical malpractices will help them change. But it almost feels like they might need something else, another golden egg or so to chase after for them to stop what they're doing. Let me, I want really quickly, because we're on this topic, which is medical disinformation by some people. I think the way you are talking, you're spreading lies, I believe. Do you get censored? I mean, on YouTube, they're probably going to just say that, this guy, Terry Schilling, is constantly spreading medical disinformation.
We haven't been censored in quite some time. I think we've gotten censored a couple times, but the biggest, most egregious case of censorship that we've had is in 2020. We launched a $4 million campaign on women's sports during the 2020 election. And we were running campaign ads against Joe Biden and Democrats who are running for the Senate. And essentially we got censored and our ads shut down off of Facebook. Facebook had this terrible system of fact checking where they formed a National Fact Checker Council, maybe International Fact-Checking Council, and PolitiFact, which is an obvious left-wing fact-checking organization. They did a fact check on our ad, and they didn't rate it as false, but they rated it as missing context, because we claim that if you put gender identity into civil rights law, like Joe Biden sought to do, you would destroy girls' sports. By saying that we were missing context, what they really meant was we didn't include the arguments from our political opponents. The whole point of a campaign ad is we're going to make our arguments and you make your arguments about your policy. But what people didn't realize is that any fact check whatsoever, as per Facebook's policy in 2020, that would mean that you are no longer allowed to run campaign ads on the Facebook platform. There was the whole anti-misinformation and anti-disinformation campaign, and ended up shutting down factual arguments and data that we were running in our campaign ads. And that was a $4 million campaign that we were running. The good news is we just switched to other methods to contacting voters, like text messaging, which is a lot more effective and a lot more cost effective. But we've now come back. Facebook has actually done a total about face on this, and we live in a new world. But it was very disheartening, because this was a fight that our whole team put so much blood, sweat, and tears into, and it was really tough. You have to go back to 2020. It was tough to go sit down with very wealthy people and make an argument that we could win voters over by talking about transgender sports. It was tough to raise that money, and Facebook just shut it down because of progressive ideologues that wanted to protect an industry. But I'm so glad that we're where we are. we ended up being victorious so far, fingers crossed, but we got to keep fighting.
But I think you have to keep fighting as well, because there's still other places like YouTube. Do you find that find them to be very censorious when it comes to when we're talking about transgenderism?
I don't think the only videos that I've had taken off of YouTube so far it's been any appearances that I had with Steve Bannon on his show War Room. And it was because I think YouTube had a policy where they completely banned Steve Bannon from YouTube. And that was terrible too, because War Room was such a great, it's still a great show, but it was in that when they shut us down and removed our videos, they actually shut our entire account down until we removed all of them, all of those videos. And we had such a treasure trove of videos from the founding organization that we just removed a few dozen of our videos with War Room. But that was very disheartening. But I don't think we've had any other ads or videos shut down off of YouTube.
Wow, I had one of my shows was titled "The Real Big Lie: Mental Health Diagnostics," and I go into the DSM-5 and I talk about what was happening in the industry and how there's the diagnostics industry is just a big mess and a crapshoot, and they called it medical disinformation. But yeah, but you have to get around it, or what do you think the incoming heads of HHS and NIH, all the health care agencies, how do you think they're going to help push all of this forward, discrediting the organizations you listed off before?
Well, President Trump, I think it was day 2 or 3, he signed his executive order to protect children from the transgender industry, and it was extensive. It was incredible. He instructs the Department of Justice to investigate anyone involved in promoting these procedures on children. But one of the most interesting things about that, and I think one of the most powerful things in that executive order, is stripping away the ability for any government agencies to rely on the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, any research that they produce, any data that they say is true. Our government's no longer allowed to use that. And that includes federal contractors, it includes hospitals that receive Medicaid and Medicare dollars. That will be very, very helpful in reining this in. What people don't understand, it's the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. It's also known as WPATH, but they just made it up. It was all the people that wanted to do transgender surgeries and give hormones to children. They literally just made it up, gave it a very sterile professional association name, and then they started producing junk science and junk research to make the arguments for them. The other thing, Bambi, that I think we should do with this report, with NIH and HHS, is release the NIH report on transgender health for minors. What was supposed to happen before the election, but it got delayed because of the findings of it, I believe. There's a $9.7 million NIH-funded study led by Johanna Olsen-Kennedy out of California that they covered up. And it was to measure the results of these transgender procedures on minors and on their mental health and on their social lives, and to see if it actually improved their lives. If that had any glimmer of optimism or benefits to children who undergo these procedures, we would have heard about it nonstop, and it would be being used right now to humiliate President Trump and all of his protections for our children. But we know what those findings show, and it's not good for this movement. So we got to get that NIH report released. And I think that will do a lot of damage to the transgender industry. And it'll do a lot of good to help protect our children, because once the medical liability insurance companies find out about this NIH funded report, this almost $10 million report, I think a lot of premiums are going to go up for any hospital or clinic that does these types of procedures.
Yeah, that would be good. But there was that CAS report that came out of the UK also, not also, but around 2020, 2021. And it seems like a lot of people just are ignoring that, even though people are talking about it so much. And it totally debunks the whole transgender ideology.
Could I make a quick point on that? I think you're right that in America it has been ignored mostly, but the European nations are not ignoring it. There are several European nations, including the UK, that have banned these for minors at all. Even experimentally, they're not allowed to do it. But I think the big difference, and I am a pro free market. I like profits. They're good. I hate more taxes. But I think the big difference here is that in Europe, they have primarily socialized medicine. There aren't profits that these hospitals and clinics and transgender surgeons can then reinvest into PR and advocacy efforts in their countries. So I think that's the maybe not the only difference, but I think it's a major difference. A lot of people are getting paid. And with how this industry works, it's actually a very small network it's growing, but it's a small group of people that you would have to pay off in order to make sure that this is still going on. So it's one thing that I've noticed is I don't know what the opposite of silver lining is, but whatever, it's a very bad thing. It's definitely a downside of the free market here.
Yeah, I want to talk about the executive order, the Protecting Children from Chemical. That's the one you're talking about, right? Protecting children from chemical and surgical mutation. It's an executive order, and so banning gender affirming care. But what I found was some lawyers are saying that providers basically can get around this. Some states can get around this. Can some states get around this federal ban?
I don't think they can. Well, they can if they decide to go without federal dollars. President Trump, just last night at the Republican Governors Association dinner, he made it very clear that the state of Maine, which has recently decided to allow males to compete in girls' sports in defiance of this series of executive orders that he signed around this issue, he has made it very clear that they are no longer going to be receiving federal tax dollars and federal revenue to their state until they are in compliance with these executive orders. And so the states can still do it. We still need to pass legislation to actually win on this fight in a significant way. But they're going to have to go without federal tax dollars. And that's very painful for a lot of these states. One thing that I'll say is I think it's incredibly important to codify these executive orders into federal law, not just to make this permanent, but so that we can make sure that the American people know which politicians are normal and decent and want to protect children from this obviously evil industry, and which ones are cowards or actually part of the problem. So we want to get votes in the House and the Senate, and then use that to unelect a lot of these guys in the upcoming midterms.
So which ones are you working on? I saw on your website, Stop the Sexualization of Children Act, Protect Children's Innocence Act. Where are those the more active ones? What are the ones that you're really working on now?
So we're working right now with Senator Roger Marshall from Kansas. He's a medical doctor, and he's actually making some changes. He had a Do No Harm Act that he introduced last year that would ban these procedures for minors. Or I think another title that they came up with was the Stop Experimentation of Children or Stop Harming Children Act. These laws keep changing, but the substance of them remains the same. They're going to end up banning these procedures across the country, but we keep going back and forth about the proper mechanism to do it. There's a debate right now internally about whether or not to do what President Trump is doing through his executive order as an enforcement mechanism, which is to deprive the states of federal tax dollars, or to just outright ban it. I think that where I'm coming down, I'm going to support whatever the Senate ends up deciding is the right bill to do this, whatever gets the most votes. But I would much more prefer a clean ban of these procedures, primarily because I think it's the cleanest and I think it's the most popular way to do this. The unfortunate thing, or in my mind, the fortunate thing about having a democracy where people get to vote is you have to get the buy-in of voters, and I think voters don't want to play accounting games or mess with tax dollars. I think they would rather just ban an evil and horrific procedure like this.
So the debate is either ban the procedure or not give tax dollars?
Specifically Medicaid or Medicare dollars. It gets a little bit dicey because we don't want to be depriving poor people of medical care just because their state's still doing these procedures. But the state's gotta, they've got to have some skin in the game, and that's essentially the argument from the people that support the alternative methods.
Besides these executive orders, maybe you can distill this down to me, because I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here with all these little these initiatives that you're doing. But what would be a big win for you in 2025 or with legislation besides just the executive orders?
Well, gosh, I hate the way this is going to sound, but it's under Leader McConnell's leadership in the Senate. His policy was that if they couldn't get to 60 votes, or if they couldn't actually pass the legislation before them, he wouldn't hold the vote. And we've got to change that, because there's more reason to hold a vote than just to pass a law. In fact, a lot of times you hold a vote to clarify where senators and members of Congress are on an issue, so that you can use that in the upcoming elections and let the voters decide if they want to make that an issue and how they vote. So a huge win for us would be if John Thune held votes on both the Protecting Women in Sports Act, but also the Stop Harming Children and Experimentation Act. Those would be huge wins, because Democrats are in a very difficult position. They have to either choose to go along with protecting children from these procedures, but if they do that, they'll lose their base, because they've spent the last decade or more lying to their own voters, saying that these procedures save lives. So their base will abandon them if they view them as joining the Republicans who are trying to eradicate trans people, to put it in their words. Or if they keep sticking with refusing to protect children from these procedures, they'll then keep losing swing voters. We've got to bring these up for a vote. I also think that there are other methods and things that we can do through the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services. There's a lot we can do, but those two things, I really want to win on this in politics at the voting booth. It's a stronger win. I don't want government agencies to be the ones leading the charge in this. I want our elected officials, the people that we put in charge to pass these laws. I want them making the decision. I want ultimately the American people to hold these guys accountable.
I want to ask you a question about, because you're also involved in education. We've got a lot to do in education. We've got a lot to do in healthcare, but they're sort of, because we're dealing with a lot of kids and protecting kids, it's a little bit of both. Where do you think, it seems like healthcare is a much bigger animal, it's complex. There's many in different parts. Do you think we can do more in the education department to really have an impact, or healthcare?
I think frankly, I think that the education reforms would do a lot more to stop the bleeding, right? So by the time that these kids are going in to get the puberty blockers and the hormone treatments and the surgeries, their minds have been corrupted, right? And it's not just the schools. The internet is very dangerous for children. These transgender activists actually talk to children online in things as innocuous as like art forums and cartoon websites. They go on these games built for children, these websites built for children, and have conversations with them about transgenderism. And a lot of kids have gotten sucked in that way. But I look at, reforms to our healthcare system to protect children through there. That's protecting their bodies. But the reforms to education and cleaning up our schools and getting gender identity out of the classroom will do a lot to protect the minds of our children. And more importantly than just the minds of the kids who end up getting confused and trapped into the transgender ideology, it will do a lot to help protect all the other kids from being culpable in these sterilizing and procedures. So I think that the schools would be a much bigger victory. But at the same time, I really hate what's happening to kids. And so I would want to at least stop the bleeding immediately from these surgeries and hormone treatments, and then fix the schools. But I think we can walk, talk, and do education reform and healthcare reform at the same time.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Stop the surgeries. You got to really stop the surgeries, and then and stop the indoctrination as well. Probably have to do a bit of both. And I'm curious. I don't know what the Secretary of Education is going to do besides just stop funding, I guess. But
yeah, well, that's what President Trump's executive order does. Is it bans federal education funding for any schools that include programs regarding DEI or transgenderism, and I think it's a good first step. These schools do have growing demands and growing needs for finances. The problem is, I think that the federal government only accounts for, I think it's a maximum of like 12% for the schools, the states that take the most funding. It ranges, I think, from 4% to 12% of education funding comes from the federal government. So that limits our ability to impact there. But I still think cutting 12% or even 4% of education budget in a state is going to cause them serious problems that should make them rethink the need for including these programs.
now this is why I got in touch with your organization. The whole DEI and gender ideology spending that you're calculating, that you're sort of watching, and was at the time it was $174 million that you had calculated. I don't know where that is now, but you seem to be doing a lot of digging. Doge is doing its own digging. I don't know if you're collaborating, but we're across the government. What do you think what are we now at? How much is being spent on DEI that we're uncovering?
Well, my guess is that it's much higher than $174 million, just because of the nature of this fight and the nature of how government spends money. But we wanted to be very accurate in terms of what we were putting out to the general public, and so we kept it at a somewhat more limited scope, and we only included grants and funding that we could specifically identify a gender identity aspect to it. And so I'm sure there's a lot more, but what we wanted to do, I like Doge. I love Doge, actually. I love what they've done. But I think that the bigger argument to make is not necessarily that government is being run inefficiently or that money is being wasted. It's much worse than that. We would be ever so lucky if government was just pouring that money down the drain. Unfortunately, what's happening is that $174 million, that's been weaponized against us. It's been used against us. Like I said, we would be lucky if they were just pouring it down the drain. But instead, they're taking our money and they're pouring it into our schools to change the hearts and minds of our children. They're using it to have programs on PBS and NPR, educational programs to make it look like it's part of the news. They've been giving money to the Associated Press and Reuters. I mean, there are all different types of funding mechanisms that have been used by our government to push progressive ideology, and it's really, really bad. And on top of that, if it wasn't bad enough that they were spending this here at home, they're spending money on these programs in other countries that don't like this stuff. And they're trying to force the gender identity issue. For example, they spent $2 million to promote gender diverse people in Bangladesh. Mm-hmm. That's not really the right audience for this. They spent over $1.2 million, I believe, in Uganda to promote gender identity programs. This is absolutely terrible. It's worse though than a waste of money. It's weaponized against us, and it's actually causing serious harm and damage.
The one that you picked out, which I thought was kind of funny, that's more at home though, in America, $600,000 from the Department of Agriculture. So the Department of Agriculture granted this, and they gave it to the Southern University the agriculture department to study menstrual cycles of men. So like there's so many things wrong with that. I mean, obviously the big one,
right?
Men don't menstruate. I don't know, when was the last time you had your period?
Well, so look, it's such a joke. It's so embarrassing that our government, and why are we just learning about this? These programs are not that new. They were happening over the last 4 years. As soon as Joe Biden got into office, they started funding this. But I think the thing that bothers me about the findings of Doge, not the findings of Doge, but the reaction from our legacy media to the finding of Doge is they've identified all these programs that are completely indefensible. There's not a single reputable defense you can put up for any of the funding that we've identified as problematic. There's a real lack of curiosity from the fourth estate in terms of what our government's been funding. Right? Is there not any bit of curiosity even to know what our government is funding overseas and abroad or here at home to push ideology? If Donald Trump was doing these types of programs here at home, I guarantee you'd know about it. But there's real corruption from our legacy media, and I believe it's because they're not even pretending to be unbiased or neutral partners anymore.
What do you say to people who say that this cost cutting is indiscriminate? It is just, or no, it is. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's, well, it discriminates actually in a particular ideology. So it's all partisan cutting. So because they think that it's all your ideology. We don't like this ideology, and so we're just cutting that specific ideology. There's a point there, right? It is partisan because we believe that ideology is an evil ideology. How do you respond to people who say, well, it's all the cutting isn't really, you're not being fair?
Well, it's not about ideology. It's about good versus bad, right? And ideology, some, even with progressivism, there are some good ideas within that. There are some good policies that progressives support. And we're not going to cut those programs. Donald Trump, for example, supports Social Security and Medicare. We're not cutting that. What we are doing is we're cutting corruption, right? So unless you believe that corruption and giving out erroneous payments from Social Security, for example, to people that are 150 years old that are still on the books, and to be clear, they're researching whether or not those payments are actually still being given out. But right. You have millions of people on the Social Security, in the Social Security database, where the death field is marked as false, that are 150 years old, 130 years old, 180 years. You have people that in this database that are 360 years old. So this isn't about ideology here. This is about fairness and what's right and what's wrong and what's in the best interest of our country. If it's in the best interest of our country, we're going to do it. If it's not, we're going to cut it. And that you have to make the argument. So if you think it's ideological, if you think we're just cutting it because it's a progressive program, well, then make your argument for why we should be giving $2 million to gender diverse people in Bangladesh, or $600,000 to the University of Southern Mississippi to research the menstrual cycles of transgender men. Right? Make your arguments for that.
Make your argument. I'm curious. I'm going to walk over and open my door so my dog can leave. Or you can see my dog is right here. Who's like,
oh, that's great. That's great.
But think about this question, which is, does the government spend money on shipping out or delivering Bibles? Does the government do it? Go ahead, leave.
There's an interesting thing here is that the federal government, right, we give $500 million to Planned Parenthood to give out contraception, do abortions, and now give transgender hormone treatments and refer for transgender surgeries. Can you imagine the Democrats ever allowing for a single dollar to be given to crisis pregnancy centers? Right? The Democrats not only will refuse to fund a crisis pregnancy center, they want to shut them down because they say that they push misinformation, disinformation to trap women into keeping their babies. Right? So it's all ridiculous. They gaslight, right? And I think that that's what's been so obvious in the past 10 years is there is so much deception in America. We've adopted all of these lies, and let me be clear. I don't think the American people as a whole have adopted all of these lies, but we hear these lies from the elites all throughout our country, in our cultural institutions. They tell us that there are health at all sizes. There's healthy at all sizes, meaning if you're obese, you're not necessarily unhealthy. That's absurd. They tell us that men can become women, that women can that males can have menstrual cycles. They tell us that children should be able to consent to sex changes, even though they can't even consent to sexual relations. There are all these lies that they are pushing on the American people, and they're just gaslighting us. When they get caught, they lie and they make things up. And so, we don't have the government funding Bibles. In fact, during the Biden administration, and actually before that, when Barack Obama was president, they removed the Bible and religious ministry from the Department of Defense. They were taking away religious ministers and religious counseling for our soldiers, which is like the most necessary thing that these guys need. I want an army full of very religious people who fear justice from their Lord, from their God. That's who you want fighting fights and going overseas, being responsible, and having to do things that a lot of us could never ever even imagine, which is to kill bad people and protect our country. But no, it's absolutely the government's funding everything, almost everything that it shouldn't, and none of what it should be.
It's good to know that they don't. I don't think that you're even allowed to. I looked at USAID. You're not allowed to distribute Bibles because you're not supposed to be funding that because of separation of church. But I saw that for USAID. I wasn't sure if that was across the government, but I think it is probably across the government.
I think if it's not entirely across the government, it's at least at USAID and the Department of Defense, and that's bad enough. But
Yes.
I was at CPAC yesterday, and Michael Knowles brought up a very good point. He spoke right before I went on the main stage for a panel on fatherhood, and he pointed out that in the 1960s, we got the Bible out of public schools. And he said, forget what you believe about the Bible to be true. This is a book, this is a document that any person would need to have at least a basic understanding or a comfortability with in order to be considered an educated person. If you don't know or have never heard of what the Bible is or don't know what it's all about, you're probably not that educated. And instead of that, once we took that out, we replaced it with sexually inappropriate books in our kids' library. So our kids in a public school library can get their hands on a book like Genderqueer. That's very problematic and even obscene, I would argue, but they can't get their hands on a Bible, which is a historical document. It's probably the most impactful document ever assembled and produced. Why is that? And I think it's because there are ideologues who want to rid the United States of our history. They want to erase Christianity and religion from America. They don't like it. And they want our children to be dependent on government officials and elites for all of their information and for their sustenance.
Is that changing now in terms of is the pendulum swinging to, from the 1963, something like that, when they took the Bible out? And now I don't think they'll bring the Bible back, maybe the 10 Commandments, but what's your sense, being surrounded by, so many people in, particularly politics, which is extremely influential over our culture and religion?
I think that the pendulum is swinging back, and I think that it can swing back very quickly. The biggest problem, I think, with the Republican Party is that it's been mostly a valueless party that's tried to simply replicate the Democrats and just come up with a slightly less or a diet Democrat policy program. But now you've had something very interesting happen, which is all the lawfare, all the attacks on Donald Trump and everyone within his orbit. And it's created almost like a super soldier, for lack of a better word. But there, if you notice, you see Stephen Miller on television going up against Jake Tapper and other people on the nightly news. You see J.D. Vance, right, saying, "I don't really care, Margaret."
Yeah.
There's this. I don't care what you say. We know that you're liars. We know that you're not fair. We know that you lie about everything just to push your agenda. And so we're just going to do what we need to do. And you can say what you want to say. We're going to do what we're going to do. And I think that that's very healthy, because what you have is a much more honest and direct Republican Party that actually is willing to say, what's ridiculous, right? For years, we couldn't get anyone really on mainstream television to call out the transgender insanity, right? Ben Shapiro got basically kicked off of CNN for telling was it Zoe Turr, who's a transgender identifying male, that he was actually a male and not a female. He got basically kicked off, and he had his physical safety threatened, and Zoe Turr wasn't fired. Ben Shapiro was kicked off of CNN. There's been a whole shift over the last 10 years. And I think it's because Donald Trump is making the Republican Party high tea again, right? We're acting like we actually believe and care about what we say we care about, and we're going to deliver on it. So look, if the last month that Donald Trump's been in office is any indication, I have a lot of optimism for the future of not just the Republican Party, but for America.
Well, I think that what's happened, and I actually did a show on this, or a small portion of it, when I said that that the Republican Party, what the Republican Party has, in which I think you were part of a panel on fatherhood, right? And if you think about what is more manly, like it's a father who protects their kid, who protects, a husband who protects his wife. And I said that the problem with the Democratic Party is that they care so much about the 300 genders, they forgot what one gender is, a man. So of course you can't define what a man is. Do you remember that video, that marketing video of what is a man, where that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz put out, and they had one guy say, "I eat carburetors for breakfast." I mean, it's so out of touch with what a woman, who wrote that? I've never heard anyone say that, or nor would that I find that attractive.
No, it's preposterous. It really is a tell that they have no clue what being a man is. I think one of the points I made yesterday at CPAC was, I think the key to getting back to normalcy and really ratcheting up the numbers against the Democrats and all this gender stuff is to talk about fatherhood, talk about motherhood, right? Fatherhood and motherhood is not the only way to be masculine or feminine, but those are the next steps in true masculine. What a father is someone who protects his kids, right? Who protects his wife, who sacrifices. Love is all about sacrifice, right? So if we focus on the positive about what we can do and what we can build, I see a future with strong mothers, strong fathers, being married and raising strong families. That's what's going to turn this country around. And that's where the Democrats can't compete with us, right? Because they reject motherhood. They look at motherhood as slavery. That's literally what the second wave feminists described, or that's how they describe feminism or motherhood as slavery, as oppression. Motherhood is beautiful. Fatherhood is beautiful. And you know what? It's all about sacrifice, which is the most necessary. It's the only necessary thing for love. There can be, who was it? Victor, oh my gosh. He wrote Les Miserables. Victor,
I don't know. I guess we can look that
oh
up.
my gosh. This is terrible. It's been, this is like my fourth interview today, and I've been up early.
Do you want me to look
Victor
him
Hugo,
up?
Victor Hugo. I remembered it. I redeemed myself. But Victor Hugo has this amazing quote, and he says, "You can give without loving, but you can never love without giving." And that these little acts of love, these little acts of sacrifice, that's what makes the world go round. And when you look at what a mother does or what a father does, it's not just these little acts of daily, submission to cleaning the house and doing the laundry and serving your family. It's what the dad does at work too, right? The dads are out there making these little sacrifices, and moms and dads make little and big sacrifices. But that's what love is. Love is all you have to sacrifice if you want to love someone. And we've adopted this crazy notion. We've redefined what love is. Love is what, I love going to McDonald's. Well, what's the sacrifice of going to McDonald's? Right? What are you willing to give up? I guess you're willing to give up your health and a little bit of money, but real love requires sacrifice. And there's no better place for love to grow than within a family where mothers and fathers sacrifice their freedom. They sacrifice their finances. They sacrifice so much for their children. And that's where children learn how to love themselves. And it's no wonder why, as we've seen fewer and fewer people getting married, fewer and fewer people having children, or people having fewer children themselves, it's no wonder why we have less love in this country. It's because we're losing the family, because that's where most of us learn how to love in the first place.
Have you had any luck helping people who don't believe in that, or who believe that they are loving people? Maybe they don't have a family. Some of them do have families. Have you had any luck in them? I call these things through line moments. The through line moment is when people start saying, wait a second, I have been gaslit too. Something is wrong. People have been lying to me. And they realize that there's this been concerted effort to sort of subvert, tradition and democracy, et cetera. Do you know people who've had that? What was your through line moment, if you've had one? I think everyone has one, actually. And then what's the best way, or have you seen other people sort of have this kind of conversion, and what was it that led them to that?
I have seen people make incredible changes to their lives after becoming mothers and fathers. And I've actually seen huge changes from even some of my friends by being around other families and other children before they have their own. I've seen 40-year-old men who have had no desire or interest in getting married and having kids spend time with my family or other families, and then come away thinking, I can't believe I missed out on this. I got to get married. I got to start having a family. I think that the family's a real example. I haven't had, I think the difference is, so there are the enemies, there's the ideological enemies. Those are like the progressives, they're the activists. Those are almost impossible to win over because they're so locked in, and they're probably the way they are because they had a really, really, really bad experience with their own family. Their parents got divorced at a pivotal moment in their lives, or they were abused, or they have abusive parents or something like that. But what I found is that these arguments and these examples of love within a family, they work the best with those that are just kind of ignorant. They're just trying to live their lives. They're not trying to accomplish an agenda or anything. They just want to have a good life. I think most Americans are still very honest and good people, but they just haven't really thought these things through. And they've been told that put off getting married until you're 35 and you've completed, your master's degree or whatever. It's just not how it works. I actually tell young people, I've been at CPAC this past 2 days. I tell young people every time I talk to them, get married young and start having babies right away, because there's no bigger motivation to make more money, to be more successful, than a wife that you have to support or kids that you have to support. That's what my path has been. I don't think I'm that exceptional. I just want to do good. I like my life. I love my life. I love my family. But I got married at 23. I had my first baby at 19, right? Yeah. I didn't do things that traditionally, but I stepped up. I never backed away from supporting my kids and being with my kids. And it's been the most pivotal thing ever. And I think that if the family and children could do what it's done to my life, I think it could work wonders with turning this entire country around.
I think you're right. I live in Silicon Valley. It's a little bit more challenging to convince people here who are workaholics, and even New York as well, to convince people to put career aside and focus on the family. And I think the family, I think you're right. When you focus on the family, that does bring you to sort of, well, you're mature, right? You have to, because you're taking on so many more responsibilities. And then you become kind of conservative because you become so aware. What I find here in Silicon Valley is that culturally, they are conservative fiscally, but they're not conservative socially. So even if they do get married, it becomes a very, they're not socially conservative. How do you switch that in, like, living in Silicon Valley, it seems hard to get all this.
Can I ask a clarifying question on that? Do you mean that they vote for fiscal responsibility and but socially liberal on politics, or are you saying that they live fiscally responsibly but live socially liberally?
That's a great They are, so there's been a bit of a shift here in voting conservative. So you've seen the tech class kind of move. Socially, they typically tend to be progressive, and and fiscally they tend to be conservative. But because for some reason Silicon Valley had turned extremely liberal, now they've shifted their vote largely on economic lines, on fiscal lines, not because of the social conservative stuff that's happening. And they are getting married. They are, a little bit later, not at 23, but a little later in life. But they still have that non-conservative way. And I see them all shifting, but yet there's still this disconnect with the conservative side. And I don't know. I know you can't answer that question in terms of how do you even shift that, but that's where I come in, where I would love to shift their mind. I think that I've gotten them closer because they made that shift to conservatism, but they've only made the shift to being conservative from a fiscal standpoint. Now, how do you get them to the social conservative side?
I have seen that. So I've spent over $1 million in focus groups, on polls, on consumer research panels, on message testing and development for swing voters specifically. And what I found is there are two issues that I would say are gateway issues to helping normies, as I would call them, just honest, hardworking people. There are two gateway issues to helping these people see the light or start to understand maybe not everything's right over here. The first is men and women's sports. When Donald Trump ran that ad, Kamala's for they, them, Donald Trump is for you. She wants to pay for transgender surgeries for inmates, right? When you bring up these issues, you had that famous clip of Charlemagne the God, who is no conservative, coming out and saying, hell no, I don't want my tax dollars funding that. That's crazy. These issues, men and women's sports, that's as pure, you could argue that the prison thing and funding those surgeries is fiscal. But the men and women's sports issue, it's an 80-20 issue. And it's a gateway, and this is why we need to have more votes on these issues, is to bring more clarity. Make these Democrats and Republicans vote for this vote on it, because they don't want to. And they don't want to because they know that when voters find out that they're voting to allow men and women's sports, that they're going to start asking other questions. And the other thing that we've noticed, and we've seen this in our focus groups here just now in Virginia, around transgender surgeries for minors. That's very important when you're talking to normies and swing voters, to make sure that they know that the Republicans and President Trump, that their policies only pertain to minors. They do not pertain to adults. Because once they realize that these are protections for minors and children under 18, they're all about them. They fully support. We had just a group two days ago. Is it 24th? Yeah, it's the 19th that we had it in Northern Virginia, Arlington, where it's super liberal. I mean, it might as well be Silicon Valley with the way people vote here. When they found out that President Trump's executive order was only about children, the room went from 10-0 against us to 10-0 with us, right? And so these are two. I'm sure there's other issues. I'm not a one. I guess I would be a one-trick pony right now with this information on the trans issue, but I would be willing to bet that there are key areas in many other policies, like immigration. Elon Musk pointed out yesterday at CPAC that the Biden administration was giving FEMA dollars meant for natural disasters. They were giving FEMA dollars to luxury hotels to house illegal immigrants in New York City. I think there are little bits and pieces here and there that really show just how nuts the Democratic policies are and how they've been going so far. And I think those are gateway issues that help people understand that these social policies are absolutely egregious. They're absolutely nuts. And there's only one party that's really pushing that. The other thing is, I think the women's sports issue and the gender transitions for minors and banning that, I think that just appeals to common sense. I don't have to quote the Bible ever to make the argument that we should protect kids and girls' sports from that stuff.
Yeah. was another issue. I think I've seen like diehard liberals from Berkeley change their tune just because they were being forced to mask, and then they started saying that's their through line moment when they said, hey, wait a second, something is going on here that's just not right. Too much government reach. So Terry, well, I've occupied a lot of your time. I don't even know what time it is, but I totally appreciate it. I think you probably have like 5 other interviews to do. So take a rest and rest your voice. But this was really wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Of course, and I'm looking at launching my own podcast, so I'd love to have you on possibly to turn the tables. You asked some really great questions. The first question was fantastic. I've never gotten that one before, and I really appreciate it. And I'm going to think more about it too. Okay,
great. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap it up here. Terry, I've been speaking with Terry Schilling. He is the president of the American Principles Project. I'm Bambi Francisco. Boys, and you've been listening to the CRT Show.